part of working with arrays is working with for loops. We can use a for loop with an array when? When can we use a for loop with an array? If we know how many elements, okay? So if we know the array is full, then we can use a for loop and that size. Now in this particular example, we have a file that has a list of names. That list of names could be empty, it could be 30 names, it could be 100 names, okay? So in this particular example, I've allocated space for 50 names because that's the maximum size that I've decided for whatever reasons, okay? I've declared a temporary variable that's a string that I'm going to read the name in from the file, okay? And then I've created a counter called numNames, which I initialized to 0. Assuming I've opened the file, I'm going to read the first name into temp name, this temporary name, okay? I've set up a while loop that's going to read until what again? What does while in file mean? So long as there's a valid record in the file. Basically it means while not end of file. The second condition for the while loop means what? What does the second condition mean? So long as I haven't counted more than 50 names into the file. Okay, so right now what is numNames? 0, so we know it's less than 50. Okay. So if I get here, then I know it was a good read. I'm going to take the name that I read in and store it at name sub 0. Everybody with me? Stop me if you have a question. Okay? What is this guy doing? Bumping the counter to say I now have one name. Okay? I read in the next guy from the file, check to see if it was a good read, and check to see if I have room in the array. And I store the value that I read in into name sub 1. I bump it and read again, and so when I get all through, we decided that I know that how many names I read from the file because the value is going to be inside numNames. So if I wanted to print all the names moving forward, I don't go from I to 50 because most likely I've not read in 50 names, agreed? I've read in numNames, okay? So I'm going to use a loop that goes from I to numNames. And that'll print the appropriate numbers. Does anybody have questions about that so far? So if you look at the exercise, we do have reading from a file, excuse me, which is the same idea, but instead I used IX rather than numNames. So if you look at the reading from a file example on page 5, it lists the same example, okay? So I want you to do number 1. Write a solution to read up to 100 numbers from the user and store it in an array. So the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to declare an array of numbers that can store 100 elements. I want you cannot use a for loop with this because how many values might the user enter? 100 or less. Okay, we're not going to allow them to do less than 100. Okay? Now, let's not worry about counting the number of positive and negative integers yet. I want you just to read in up to 100 numbers from the user and store it into an array. So what kind of loop are you going to have to use? Well, okay, so go ahead and exercise number 1. Read in 100 numbers. So use a while loop and go ahead and set it up for exercise number 1. So we're just doing reading 100 numbers from the user and storing in an array, up to 100 numbers. So we need 2 conditions. What is the first condition? Okay, let's do it something else besides nums. I'm going to call it count. Okay? So that means that what should the second condition be? Okay, so while num is not equal to 0. Agreed? Not nums, because nums is the array. I'm going to use this temporary variable. Okay? So now how do I initialize this condition prior to the loop? Yep. And then how do I initialize this condition? Everybody knows this. How do I do it? How do I initialize the entering a number stopping at 0? So what do I do here? And I'm just going to read this into, I could read it into the array, but for now I'm just going to read it into a separate one. Okay. So I read in a number. So if I get here, what should I do? What should I do with the number that I read in? Okay, well, I'm going to put, this is the array. Right? That takes the value that the single value that I read in and puts it into the array at the 0th location. So I just made one num and one num. That's why I like to use plural for the array. Does everybody see what I did? So I read it into a variable. If it's not equal to 0, then I'm going to put it into the array. Does that make sense? Ask me a question if you have, okay? So my two conditions were it's not 0 and I have room in the array. If those are not both valid, or if I have a good number and I have room, I put it into the array. You with me? Okay, so then what do I do next? What shall I do to restart this loop? So I want to do this. You with me? So now this will work. This will read in values from the user, store them in the array, and now what it wants me to do, it wants me to print the numbers back to the screen. Ideas how I would print the numbers back to the screen now. What should I do now if I want to now print the numbers back to the screen? What can I use? And what else? What kind of loop? Question? Okay, so I use count in here as always reading them in. Okay? So what's in count when I'm finished with this? How many I read in. So I don't want to lose that number. So I'm going to restart it. I'm going to use count. This is actually wrong. I'm going to fix this in a second. But I don't want to reuse count because count is telling me how many I read in. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's watch this and let's first of all see what's wrong with this. Okay? So I'm going to enter a couple numbers. And let's see what it printed. Well, the first couple were right, but why is this all this crap in all the rest of the guys? Somebody explain to me why there's a bunch of junk in this array. I allocated space for 100. I put 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the array. The rest of it's just wasn't initialized, so it's just garbage that was there. But I printed all 100. How many did I actually want to print? The 4, which that number is this guy right here. That's where I did the count. So if I use count, that's how many values are in that array now. So the point here is, I don't know what you call it, but the size of the array and the number of elements you read in are probably not the same thing. Does that make sense? It's kind of a disadvantage of C arrays because they're static. C++ arrays are static. You're stuck with the size. And if you don't use the whole array, you have to keep track of that size that you read in and use that subsequently, not the maximum size. Otherwise, you're going to have all kinds of garbage values if you try to average and things like that, right? Okay, does that make sense? Okay, all right, so try the next problem. Try reading in up to 10 letters. Well, wait a minute, do I need to do the, no, I don't think I need to finish number one. The number of positive and negative, does everybody know how should we do that? Let's finish it. So if I wanted to print the number of positive and negative inside the array that I just read in, again, make sure that you use a for loop, but make sure that you only go to count. So I would have, and then what should I do here? If what? What should I do in order to count the number of positive or negative? What's the name of the array? Nums. So if nums sub I is greater than 0, what should I do? Again, watching this value here. Okay, so let's try number 2. We're reading up to 10 letters into an array. Period is the sentinel value. So you're getting values from the user. When they enter period, that's when you stop. So go ahead, and then I want you to first write the first loop. You need 2 loops here. One is to read them in, and the other is to print this string backwards. Go ahead and write it. They're characters, they're letters. So they're reading in an A, a B, a C, a D. Yeah, they're going to read them in one at a time, and you're going to quit when it's a period. And then we're going to print it backwards. Okay? So one of them is that the letter is not equal to a period. That's the sentinel condition. Okay? Okay, and can you go ahead and declare letter as an extra? Okay, there you go. All right, perfect. Okay, who's next? You want to do the next one? Prime. One of these is really easy. We need 2 priming steps for each one of the conditions. How do I prime this guy and how do I prime this guy? Who thinks they know one of these? So the first thing he's going to do is going to set count to 0, which starts at the beginning of the array. So once you've got your while loop, remember the loop is the hard part, and then set up the priming part, right? What gets this started? So he's going to ask for the first letter, and if it's a period, you're done and there's no more letters. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, now what do we do once we got a good letter? What do we do inside the loop once we've got a good letter? So he's got a letter that's not a period, so he's going to store it in the array. Okay? Does everybody see what we did? Whatever letter we read in, we stored it at the beginning of the array. Thank you. Okay, now what? Now we need to do the 2 restart conditions. So once you've got those conditions, you can figure out the start and the restart. Setting up the loop is the trigger for everything else. Does that make sense? Okay? So don't just copy it, understand it. So no matter what the problem looks like, you understand conceptually how this works. Okay? Now, I'm going to go ahead and do the next step. Thank you. Now, let me ask you this. I now want to print this. I probably would have put this before. I don't know. I don't like incrementing till I like doing it. To me, once you've got a good letter, you want to then bump count. Okay? Now, how do I print this string backwards? Who thinks they know how to print this string backwards? Okay, now this is the right idea, but let's run this and see what happens. Okay, so enter a couple letters. Do you see what happened? She used the 10, which was the size. Okay? And she went backwards, which was right. What is the index I want to start at? No, not if I'm going backwards. Okay, so I've got letters sub 0. I've got 5 letters. So that means what's the last index? That's what. Does that make sense? 5 doesn't really exist. So it's a good question. So I'm starting at however many I read minus 1, because that's the index of the last letter. I'm starting there, and then I'm going down, including 0. Okay, cool. Everybody with me? All right, let's do something different now. Just like I have one-dimensional arrays, guess what else I can have? Multiple dimensional arrays, okay? I can have two-dimensional. I can have three-dimensional. I really can have any dimension, all right? We indicate dimension by putting sizes after the name of the array. And so we've seen where we would use a single array and parallel arrays, okay? But there's a lot of applications for two-dimensional arrays. Yeah, so one of the big applications for two-dimensional arrays is game boards. Chess, tic-tac-toe, battleship, checkers. These all have a grid, and a two-dimensional array works really well with that, okay? Now, when we look at a two-dimensional array, the first number indicates the number of rows, and the second number indicates the number of columns, okay? Now, that's just physically, that's just virtually in memory. Let's look at this example right here, where I have a table that has 3 rows, 1, 2, 3 rows, and 4 columns, okay? Now, two-dimensional arrays are not that hard because we usually use for loops with them, okay? But here's where people screw up. You know how in a spreadsheet, if I was going to write this column, I would go column and then row. You know how you go A1, A2? Forget all that, okay? Because when I indicate an element of a two-dimensional array in programming, I use the row first and then the column. And students really get thrown off by this, okay? So this guy right here is table 0, 0. But this guy right here is what? 0, 1. Which might go against what you, I don't know how bingo works, B2, whatever, I don't think we have a big bingo crowd here, but anyway, a lot of the things that we do, we use the column number first. Forget that thought, okay? So that is one of the biggest, mistakes that people have to get used to doing, all right? So now this is not what it looks like in memory. In memory, it's stored as what we call row major order, which means that 0, 0 is stored first, 0, 1, 0, 2, and 0, 3 are stored. So it's linear in memory, obviously. Okay? Now, can you guess how we would go about doing work on a two-dimensional array? How would we go about setting this whole array to zeros, for example? Nested for loops. Our buddy, the nested for loops, right? Okay? So if you're not familiar with a nested for loop, then you're going to struggle a little bit with this. But otherwise, this is what they look like in memory. Otherwise, we're going to use nested for loops. Now, my piece of advice when working with two-dimensional arrays is use good index names. Use good index names. So let's look at what happens here. So what happens here? What is the first thing that happens in this guy? Row is 0. And then what happens next? Is 0 less than 10? Column is 0. Is column... So let's do a simple one. One of the projects that I give students is I ask them to do a tic-tac-toe. Okay? So what type would I use for a tic-tac-toe game? 3 by 3. And what type should I use? Okay. All right, so I'm going to use a nested for loop. So I'm going to initialize this whole thing with question marks because blanks wouldn't be too useful, right? And then let's write another guy that's going to print it. It printed all my question marks. It's just not in a very pretty format. Well, when do I want the end L? At the end of every row. That's exactly right. So does anybody have any ideas how I could fix this? Okay, so tell me how I could put an X in the middle. And how about if I put an O right here? How would I put an O right here in the bottom? Now, can I make this guy, since I want to be able to print a lot, can I make this guy a function, and I need to pass it So how do I call it? How do I call print board? I say print board, and what should I pass to it? The name of the array. I don't need any coordinates. Does that look better? Okay? Okay, so let's turn this over and let's look at the two-dimensional array exercises we have on the back here. And I want everybody to fill in number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've got a two-dimensional array called matrix. Everybody, what course do you learn that in? Is that discrete? Linear algebra? So you guys know what a matrix is. It's a table of numbers. So in this case, we've created a matrix which has 4 rows and 3 columns. So everybody, the value of 0, 2 is 9, 5. So go ahead and fill in 2 through 4. Make sure you know how to read these values. Now I've given you the row number, so I've made it kind of easy, right? Because I put the row numbers in the example. But a lot of you were struggling with the tic-tac-toe, remembering that they're all 0 based. 3 rows means you have row 0, 1, and 2. There's no row 3. So in this case, we have 4 rows. So we have 0, 1, 2, and 3. And 3 columns, which is 0, 1, and 2. So what is the value of matrix sub 2 sub 1? 7.8. What is the value of matrix sub 1 sub 2? Minus 45, good. What is the value of matrix sub 3, 1? Okay, good. So that's good so long as I gave you the row, I put the row numbers in there. I won't be doing, you know what I mean? Like that's, okay? So typically you're not going to have these 2 top columns when I ask you those types of questions. Okay? All right, so let's try the last problem, which is to create a character table called junk with 4 rows and 5 columns and set every value in junk to all blanks. Who would like to set all the values in the array to blanks? So what do we need whenever we're working with a whole two-dimensional array? We need what? Nested for loops. And the trick that I gave you is use good names for your indexes rather than I or J. So the outer for loop is going to be, what would be a good name for the outer for loop index? What would be a good name? Row, right? Okay, so go ahead. And where should he start row? Okay, and where should row go to? Less than 4, right? If we do less than 4, then it'll go 0 to 3. Good. Okay? It's 3, but it should be, let's not add a new number. I like less than 4, okay? All right. Okay, good. And then what should your second one be? Don't put a semicolon there. We don't want a semicolon there, okay? And then the next guy is going to be what? Column. And column's going to go from 0 to 5. Does this make sense? It's 0 base, so you've got to get used to that. But if you start at 0 and go up to the number, not including the number, you'll be okay. Okay, then what should he do inside the loop? You're going to take what? Don't tell him what. Do you know what to do? What's the array name? You don't need to set it to anything, just row. Row and column. Do you see what I'm saying? So it'll go through, and then just set one, and then say equals, and to give it a blank. You know how to do that? Single quote, blank, single quote. That's it. Single quote, blank, and that's it. Semicolon. That's it. Does that make sense? That's it. Okay? And then anything you want to do, thanks. Anything you want to do to that array, what about if I wanted to print it? What's that? Add cout, and I'd have to think about when to do the endl again, you know, and the endl goes at the end of it. Who wants to try printing it? Who wants to try printing this? Ryan, you up for trying it? So to print this, printing it straight is easy. Printing it horizontal is easy. Getting it lined up right is a little tricky. That's when I say to ask yourself, when do I want the end out? Okay? You can copy and paste everything. Why don't you just copy and paste everything? All right, so now what did I do in order to print this tic-tac-toe board? Because then I'm going to finish the whole row, then I'll do an end line. If it makes sense, don't try to memorize this. Make sure it makes sense, or don't try to find it on your